Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are at. It is Friday afternoon for me. I'm taking a little break from the farm, got all the Friday chores done, and decided to mesh in some time for Davin to reply to another email. He had sent some questions a while ago, responded back with a video here, and then he provided some more context because I did have some questions for him. So we're going to run through these questions that he sent, do another Mealworm Q&A. If you guys have any questions and you'd like to get some feedback like this, just send me an email, justin@midwestmealworms.com. That'll come straight to me, and then I will weave in some time to do this. So let's get started. Question one. First of all, you mentioned after you separate the beetles from their egg, before the babies start growing out of their exoskeleton skins, you spray them with water. On what day do you give them water spray, and does spraying them with water ever give you trouble with pests? Awesome question. I've been getting a lot of questions about the spraying. I just started doing that again about 4 weeks ago now. I did it in my old farm. We did it there for, I want to say like 6 to 9 months. And we stopped just because we ran out of space. We were actually stacking trays up so much in there that we ran out of space, and it wasn't productive anymore for us to be moving all that stuff around. So we stopped that. And then when we moved into the new facility now, we got everybody in here, got acclimated, got settled, and then I started looking at ways to optimize things. And one of the things that we were doing, that when we went back and looked at numbers, we did see an increase in the mealworm growth whenever we were spraying the younger trays. And it makes sense because the mealworms can pull moisture out of the air, right? So that's why high humidity helps them, because it's less energy required for them to pull that moisture out of the air. And so the young ones can do that pretty efficiently, but it's much better if they can ingest it. They use less energy doing that. The problem with giving young ones moisture is that you have to finely chop it or grind it up or something to be able to spread it across the tray so that they can all get to it without having to travel long distances. Because if they're traveling long distances, for a mealworm anyway, a baby one especially, they're using energy that, instead of using energy for growth, they're using that energy to move. And so by spraying the tray or by putting small amounts of moisture on top, it gives them more availability, and then they can grow faster. So I started spraying, and what we do is I follow a regimen. It's very similar to giving moisture to the large mealworms every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, every 2 days basically. And then traditionally here in the US, the weekend, Saturday and Sunday, are days off. What I will do though is I will come in on Sunday. I come in on Sundays to prep mealworms that are going to get shipped out on Mondays. And so I'll come in on Sunday and I'll hydrate and feed those mealworms that are going to get shipped. And then I will also hydrate the larger mealworms. So I will give them some extra, extra dose or an extra hit of moisture, because I know they're going to be able to eat it and consume it before Monday, the normal feeding day. I don't spray on back-to-back days though. And the reason for that is I am avoiding mold and grain mites. Just like any moisture source, if you overdo it, if you put in too much of that, you are increasing the likelihood of mold and any sort of pest like a grain mite that loves that moist environment. And so by doing it every 2 days, what we're doing is we spray or we hydrate with water gel crystals, whatever it is you use. The goal is that within 24 hours, all of that is eaten or gone. And so in this case, Davin, when you are doing this, well, I'm sorry, that's a future question I watched one of the videos about. So we'll get to that. So I have not had trouble with pests yet. We deep freeze our bran right now for 48 hours before we use it. So 0 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 days. And that has resulted in no mite outbreaks as of yet. I was very nervous about introducing the spraying though, but so far we have not had any issues there. I'm probably also going to take a proactive approach and start adding split pea flour into the substrate mix, about a 5 to 10% mix, as a way to detract any mites. Split pea flour has been shown to be a good detractor for mites because they'll eat it, consume it, they'll die. And so by integrating it into the substrate, it's a good way to proactively tackle a mite outbreak. The mealworms will eat it. They don't prefer it, but they will eat it. So having it in there with them isn't detrimental to them. So I'm going to start doing that probably in the next month or so. I have a lot going on in the next few weeks from the farm perspective. But once I do that, I'll be posting and sharing along the way. Question number 2, speaking of pests, I have a lot of pest trouble. I noticed there are 3 types. One is shaped like an adult darkling beetle, but much smaller. I don't know which one that is. Second one is like a caterpillar, and third one is a small butterfly. I don't know the name of that one. All of them are attached in videos, and I watched those. Thank you for that. The visuals were very helpful, except the butterfly. I can't get a picture of that. Right, they move pretty quick. My question is, do you have these similar problems? How do I get rid of them and prevent them? And do they eat mealworm eggs or mealworms, or only the substrate they live in? So out of the 3 that we're talking about here, there were 2 that I can 100% tell you for sure what they were. One is the lesser mealworm. I saw the larvae. They're darker, and if you look at them from the side, a mealworm is going to be round from the side. A lesser mealworm is more flat. And so it's going to be a little squatter, a little shorter, and they also move very fast compared to a mealworm larva. So they're darker, they're flatter, and they move a lot quicker. Those are lesser mealworms. They're not going to harm the larva, the mealworm larva. They're in the same sort of family area, but it's not something that you want to leave in that bin because they propagate quickly. They go through the same life cycle as a Tenebrio molitor, the regular mealworm. They'll pupate, they'll turn into a beetle, and that's actually the beetle that you're seeing. The beetles come out and they're smaller. They are, like, if you look top down from a beetle, so the beetle's butt is here and the head is here, the darkling beetle, the mealworm beetle will be yay big when it's zoomed in, and the lesser mealworm beetle is just shorter. I guess we could go with length there. I'm sure I'm driving all the insect epidemiologists, or epidemiologists, entomologists crazy. Not using the correct terms. Hopefully someone can throw those in the comments and help me out for future videos here. So not a huge problem, but be proactive about it when you see them. You could raise them. Some people raise lesser mealworms. You could raise them, but separate them. And if you don't want to raise them, go ahead and cull them, put them in a freezer, feed them to animals. They are a good protein source. They just aren't something that you want to intermingle if your goal is to raise mealworms. The second one, the furry one, or the hairy one, that is a dermistid larva. Dermistid larvae are commonly used in things like taxidermy because they eat dead material. I'm actually doing a couple tests right now. I've got one where I want the dermistid larva to pupate, so I can get pictures of the pupa, get some videos, get some close-ups, so that hopefully we can try to get some info out to the groups here on how to deal with these. And knowing them is part of that battle, right? So I've got one where I'm trying to get it to pupate, and then I have another one where I'm just experimenting with, will they eat things that are alive versus dead, beetles, larvae, etc. So I've got videos on that on the YouTube channel and other places as well. So definitely check those out. But from a mealworm farming perspective, they are not welcome guests. A lot of farms, I shouldn't say a lot, I know of farms that use them as a cleaner crew. Same thing with the lesser mealworms. They're commonly referred to as a cleaner crew because they eat dead material. The problem with the dermistids is that when the larvae pupate and then become a beetle, those beetles can fly. So in your standard mealworm farm, the beetles aren't flying around. Tenebrio molitor beetles don't fly. I've heard that if the temperatures are high enough, they do. What I have witnessed and seen is that they will fall with grace. So if you drop one, or if one comes out of a container, they will get, their wings will come out. They are capable of doing that, and they will gracefully glide down to the ground. But I have not seen one launch and actually fly upwards. So the dermistid beetles do fly though, and the dermistid beetles are identifiable because they look very different from a mealworm beetle or a lesser mealworm beetle, and they have a white belly. So if you flip it over and you see a white, white and black belly, that is a dermistid beetle. So I call those when I see them. I'm actually struggling with them right now. doing some treatments along the outside base of my farm, because they're a naturally occurring pest. A lot of times here in the US, they'll be in homes, like up in the attic, in the baseboards or in the walls, because they do eat insulation. They can survive on that, much like a mealworm can. And so they'll be in homes and whatnot. So unfortunately, I have some of that here, so I've been battling them and trying to get rid of them. What I have noticed so far, I thought that those dermistids would eat live mealworms, but the test is proving otherwise. So I have a beetle and multiple dermistid larvae in here, and one unfortunate mealworm. And so far, they've been in here probably a week at this point, and they have not, the larvae have not attacked the live mealworm and tried to eat it, which I was not expecting. So we'll see how that experiment pans out. The other one, the moth or the butterfly, it's probably a pantry moth or a variation thereof. Those generally, what you'll notice is in your substrate, they'll build a tunnel in that substrate and lay their eggs. And so if you find that, you're sifting your substrate or you're moving it around and you find these clumps that seem like kind of stringy and almost like a spider's web down inside that bran or substrate, depending on what you're using, those are from those moths. And so that needs to be removed. It's probably got eggs in it. And then from dealing with it once there's an outbreak, sticky traps are a good option. So I actually have just a normal fly trap in here just to get the flies, because flies are a pest right now. But these would also work for pantry moths. Something sticky, they'll land on, they'll get stuck, and then you can take care of them. Proactively though, heat or freeze your bran. Or your substrate. Sorry, I keep going to bran because that's what we're using here. In the future, as I scale up, it's going to be much more difficult to treat the bran or the substrate ahead of time. And so I'm going to mess around with adding the split pea flour proactively to tackle stuff like that. I'm not sure that works on the lesser mealworms though. Curious how, question number 3. Sorry, curious on how to give them moisture every 2 days using water gel crystals, or hydrogel, as you referred to it. I think they're one and the same, basically. There's different compounds that are used from a water gel perspective. So they're all interrelated, but if you're going to use them for insects, they make brands, or they make kinds that are specific for insects. Don't get things that have dyes in it. A lot of the stores here in the US will carry colored water gel crystals for things like crafting or for plants, and they add the dyes in them to make them more colorful and pretty, and people buy them. You don't want that for your insect farm, so get the stuff that is geared for insects. You tried using it, although you're not sure if it's the same as mine. Correct, it may not be. That's okay. It's the same family kind of thing. You notice that after you give it to them, it's dried up after 24 hours and they're not consuming it. Yes. So I don't think it's a matter of you not having the correct one or using the right one. So water gel crystals don't have natural ingredients is the word I'm trying to think. Natural like nutrition sources. So like if you put a potato or a carrot into your bin, those mealworms are going to eat it because of the moisture, but also they're going to get nutrients out of it, right? With the water gel crystal, there's no nutrient component to it. It's strictly a water delivery system. They get all their nutrients from other things like wheat bran in my case. And so once that thing's dried up, they have no incentive to eat it. And what I found is if I overdose a bin with water gel crystals, they won't eat it all. It'll dry up and then it just stays there. They don't want to eat it because it's hard for one. Whenever it dries up and when it's in its dry form, it's very hard and dense, and it's going to take a lot of energy for them to eat through that. And they may not physically be able to eat through that now that I think about it. So it may be that you're just overdoing it with those hydrogels. So I would suggest tapering back the amount that you're using in that tray. That's a general rule for any moisture source. So even if you had asked me that question and you were talking about carrots, I put in carrots and then they dry up and they don't want to eat them or mess with them. If you overdose the moisture, it's going to dry up and they're just not going to be as interested in it as they were before. The other thing that could be a factor is what is the humidity in your environment? Because if your humidity is very, very low, then those things are going to dry up a lot faster. So it could be overdosing, could be humidity. We try to shoot for 70% humidity here. Anything around 50% and above is going to be very good. Anything below that, and you're going to need to apply moisture more frequently, and you're going to have scenarios where your moisture sources are going to dry up as well. So that's probably what's going on there. I don't think you're doing anything wrong. It's probably just too much in a single bin, or it's just such a dry environment that it's drying very quickly. So I would suggest lowering, for either problem there, lowering the amount you're putting in. If you have an extremely dry environment, you may need to feed more frequently, to feed that moisture source more frequently. So I'm doing it every 2 days because I'm in 70% moisture. And so I'm basically guaranteeing that they're going to be able to eat through everything that I put in that bin by the next time that I feed them. And in the meantime, if they need moisture, it's a nice moist environment. So hopefully that helps with the hydrogel thing. Continue to tinker with it. It's one of those things that it can take some time to get used to it, to understand how it's going to be used in the bin. The other thing that I try to do with the water gel is I try to get it across the tray. And so sometimes that can be difficult. It looks like the hydrogel that you have is a very fine particulate. And what I have found, I get a large polymer, a large particle. And so it's a rather large, I mean, it gets to be about, a ½ inch in diameter once it's hydrated. And then I take a handful of that and just fling it across the tray to get that moisture spread out. Every now and then I'll get a part of a batch that is very fine, like the dust for me. But it looks like you're actually getting a very fine particulate here. And I've noticed that it becomes like a gooey, it's not like Jello or agar where it's a solid piece. It's a gooey, gross piece. And it doesn't spread well in the tray. And so I would equate that to like taking a potato, cutting it in half and throwing that half a potato in there. It's not going to disperse, and it's also not making that moisture available from a surface area perspective, right? So on that half a potato, you're going to have all the mealworms connect onto that half that's exposed. They'll start eating it, but there's only so much surface area available. So if you slice that thing up, you're exposing more of the inside, more of the moisture. Same thing with the hydrogel. So if I get a batch that has that, a lot of times it'll rise to the top for me. Your batch might entirely be this consistency. And so I take that and I kind of squeeze it in my hand across the tray to try to spread it out. So it's not just put in a clump or in big clumps. I try to spread that across the tray so that they've got more surface area, and then it's broadcast to hit the entire bin. And then I will also post in the description here, I will put a link to the two sources. They're in the US, but they'll have, I know one for sure has what the actual polymer is that is the insect gel. So that way you can maybe compare it component to component for the one that you're using, and we'll continue to collab and figure out how things go. All right, question number 4. The one you mentioned in your video, using a certain size tray, do you need to separate the mealworms into several boxes after they grow up? I'm also using similar measurements at the moment, but mealworms always end up overpopulating and they don't grow well. Also, do you pick the dead beetles out every few days from the boxes, or do you have a specific schedule for that? Awesome questions. So let's tackle the beetle one first, because that's the simplest and most straightforward. So we do not pick dead beetles out of bins. It's too labor and time intensive. We'd be doing that all day long if we tried to do that. So right now, those dead beetles do stay in the bin. We have not seen any sort of degradation in health of the beetle bin from the die-off. We've not seen any sort of like pests or flies or gnats or things like that. And so it hasn't it hasn't been a necessity to try to take them out. So we've left them in. And what we do is every week we will do beetle swap, where we separate the substrate from the beetles and then put those beetles into a new bin with fresh substrate to lay eggs again for another week. And what we're doing is when we separate the substrate and the beetles, we don't mess with separating the dead beetles out. We just put them all in. And so it's a pretty quick process. Like I said, we haven't noticed a reason or a need to get those dead beetles out. They don't seem to smell terrible either. That being said, we exhaust the air here frequently, and we're wearing full face respirators. So even if there is a mild smell, we're not smelling it because the filters are getting it. And so I can understand, and I have heard of others that, you know, if you're raising your mealworms in, you know, a garage or in a piece of, or a place within your home, that could be a reason why you would want to get those out of there. A really good method for that is you want to separate your beetles from your substrate. So you just have your beetles, live and dead beetles together, separate the substrate out, and then take those beetles and pour them over an egg carton. It's a very common thing that we use in the US. Pour them over cardboard, pieces of newspaper that are crumpled up to give them something to connect and latch onto. And what will happen is pour them on there, wait a minute or two. It does not take very long. And then what you'll do is you'll flip that over. So the egg carton, like, we'll flip it over, the dead ones fall off. Some live ones will fall off, but for the most part, those live ones will hold on, and then you could shake that off into another tray. I do have a video, the beetle reclamation video. So I did do an experiment about a month and a half ago. I started it to see if collecting the beetles, the old beetles, and putting them densely populated in a tray would be worth it from a labor, time, space perspective. And by worth it, I mean how many mealworms would we potentially get out of that. So that experiment's ongoing. But that video, I do that process of pouring the dead beetles onto egg cartons, flipping them over, and then shaking them off. I did that because I wanted to be able to weigh the live beetles to get a good consistent number. I think I put 3,000 or 4,000 in each tray, which is way overpopulated. But again, I'm just kind of testing it to see what happens. So that's one of the methods that is very good at separating the live and dead beetles. We don't do that generally in the normal processing, but again, if you have a need for that, that could be a good method to get them out. And I thought that was going to be the quick part of this question. So the other part, do you find the need to separate mealworms into several boxes after they grow up? Yes. Using similar measurements, but the mealworms always end up overpopulating and don't grow well. So I think that there's a point where efficiency becomes inefficient. And what I mean by that is, if you were to be able to put in an exact same age beetle group in a bin, and you were able to separate that at the appropriate times, you could consistently get the same number of eggs in a tray. That's pretty tricky to do. It takes a lot of data. It takes a lot of labeling and a lot of manual labor to keep up with that. And so it's the goal of that, though, like what would happen if you did that is that those eggs, you'd get a similar number of eggs in each tray, and then you would know how much bran or substrate to put in there, and approximately how long, after some testing, you'd figure out how long it takes for them to get to an adult size, or a large mealworm size. But that's going to take a lot of time. It takes a lot of labeling, a lot of tracking, just a lot of work. And in my mind and in my head, that becomes inefficient. And so there's a point where it doesn't make sense to get to that granular level. But theoretically and realistically in certain operations, they will put a certain amount of eggs into a tray, and those eggs are the optimal number of eggs that will grow in that tray as efficiently as possible. There's a couple studies, Juan Ramos Morales did a couple studies on population density, and I think there's some other ones as well, but he's the first one that comes to mind, where they looked at the age of a mealworm and population density age and size, to see what was optimal. And what they found is when they were younger, when the larvae are younger, if they are more densely populated, they grow faster. And then when they get bigger, they need more space. What we're doing here, what I'm finding is we do a beetle swap. And what I mean by that is we take our beetle trays, we let them lay eggs for a week, then we separate those beetles out, put that egg-laden substrate back into that original tray, take those beetles and put them in a fresh tray with fresh substrate. We do that once a week for 8 weeks on each tray, and then after those 8 weeks, those beetles are culled and fed to chickens. And what we find is that because our beetle trays are different ages, so we've got beetles right now that are only a week old that are laying eggs, and we've got beetles that are 8 weeks old laying eggs. A 1-week-old beetle is going to lay more eggs per day than an 8-week-old beetle. So those fresh trays have more eggs than those younger trays, or than the older trays, sorry. So to clarify that, the newly hatched beetles that are only a week to 2 weeks old are going to lay more eggs per day than an 8-week-old beetle. And so there's going to be some variation there, right? You're going to have a tray that has a ton of eggs in it. You're going to have a tray that doesn't have a ton of eggs in it. Still has a lot, but not a ton. And what that results in is over time, you're going to have trays where the tray with all the young beetles that has a lot of babies in it, that's going to grow faster. And then your other tray is going to grow a little slower. So from an optimal perspective, it would be best if you had the same number of eggs in every tray. But that takes a lot of work, like I mentioned. And so it's one of those things where in our operation here, what's happening is those larvae grow, get to a certain age where you've got large ones in there, and then they'll start to pupate. And that's our trigger here. Once we start to see either the large worms and we know it needs to be done, they're out of bran and substrate, it needs to be taken care of, or we come in after a weekend and I've failed to check it. It's my fault not looking Sunday. We look at it Monday and there's some pupa in there. We want to get those pupa out because we don't want beetles in the trays laying eggs getting in the frass. And so once they're that size, we'll go ahead and harvest. And so we sift out the frass, we separate based on size. And what we find is that in a tray that has never been sifted before, never harvested, never separated, we'll get, I'm guessing here, maybe 20% large that get harvested. The rest go back into a tray because they're not fully grown yet. They're not the size that I need them to be. They're not the size that folks want from a live insect perspective. And so they go back into a tray with more substrate. Now, ideally, if those, like I was talking about from a best or a most optimal perspective, if all of those mealworms were the same age and there was the right quantity in there, then theoretically, when the substrate's gone, you put in the right amount of substrate, when that substrate's gone, you have an entire bin of harvestable large mealworms. Unfortunately, that's just too much labor, too much work right now. And I'm not using any technology that I can even separate those eggs out. So that's part of the reason. So yes, we're finding mealworms of different sizes, different ages, because a bin of beetles that lays for a week, if that egg that's laid on day 1 versus that egg that's laid on day 6 or 7, that is going to be a drastically different size mealworm 8 weeks later. Because as they start to grow and get bigger and bigger and bigger exponentially, this other one you start to see a bigger size variance. And so that's part of what's going on there. I don't think you're doing anything wrong because I don't think I'm doing anything wrong. You could optimize it, but it's going to take a lot of work. So I would recommend continuing what you're doing and try to see if there's a way for you to either introduce new beetle trays at the same time. You could go down to the granular level of sifting your trays based on days or separating for beetle swap based on days. There's a lot of different options there, but they get complicated and they get very laborious. So hopefully that's a good answer there for you. Let me just go, you're also using similar measurements. Mealworms always end up to overpopulate and they don't grow well. Yep. And so what we're doing is when we get to that point where there's either no substrate or we start seeing pupa, we do that harvest. And at that point, we're going to see variance in sizes from small to medium to large. And we just separate those with our sifter. take the large, take a percentage to keep the colony going. The rest are going to go out the door from a sales perspective, and the smaller ones go back in a bin to keep on growing. So, all right, question number 5. Do you ever try to dry your mealworms for customers? If yes, do you have any tips on it? How many kilograms of worm does it take to produce 1 kilogram of dried ones? So I have dried mealworms before. I have a microwave dehydrator that I've used, but I don't do it extensively. A couple reasons for that. One is I am basically sold out every week of the live mealworms that I produce today. So I'm working on scaling up. We've talked about that in other videos. But I don't have any excess mealworms available. My primary customer base is wanting live insects. And so I sell live insects to them, and I don't have any left over right now to then need or necessitate me dehydrating them to get them shelf stable and then selling them over time. The other thing is, from a business perspective, I can't compete with imported dried mealworm prices. Labor is a very big impact on me with my business located in the US. And so if I were to try to scale this or try to do dehydrated mealworms, I would have to charge an exorbitant amount compared to imported mealworms. And there's not a need to get into that. It is what it is. To try to solve that, it's too big of an issue for me. But from a business perspective, I'm just not focused right now on dehydrated mealworms. I know multiple companies in the US that are, so there are companies that are trying to do it. When I have done it, what I've noticed is if you try to do it in an oven or a slow bake or cook method with a really low temperature over a long period of time, what that will do is it will turn the mealworms black and they become unappealing visually. There's nothing wrong with them. That's just when you look at it, you're kind of like, ooh, like we're used to seeing things that are dead or dying or have diseases. We associate that with dark coloring, black, green, that sort of thing. And so when you do dehydrate a mealworm in an oven at a low temp, they tend to do that. They turn black. And that's just the fat inside of the mealworm. It's natural. It's not decaying, or it's not, anything that's terrible. It's just visually unappealing. So from a marketing or consumer perspective, if you go to sell those dehydrated mealworms to someone, you may run into that. Oh, that doesn't look visually appealing. But that's why it's a natural thing that happens from the fats that are inside of those mealworms. So the other options, freeze drying is actually one of the more, I wanted to say more better, that's not good grammar. One of the better ways to do it from a nutrient perspective, and you don't have that visual, unappealing brownish blackishness. The problem is that freeze drying is very expensive. And very electric heavy. So I have the microwave dehydrator. I went with that option for a couple of reasons. One of them was the amount of electric used for just extremely high. Do I have any tips on it though? So when I did it, what you want to do is you want to purge the mealworms for about 24 to 48 hours. No food, no moisture. Let them work everything through their system. And at that point, I put them in a deep freeze for 24 hours so that they were asleep or dead at that point. And then I went through the microwaving process. So that the cleaning out of it is important if you're going to do this for human consumption, and there's probably a whole set of rules for that. The US isn't ready for that yet, so I haven't even researched and tried to do very much with that from a human food perspective. From how many kilograms do you get from one, or how many worms does it take to produce 1 kilogram of dried ones? A mealworm is about 60% moisture. So when you dehydrate a kilogram, you're going to get rid of 60% of that weight. And so if your end goal is 1 kilogram, you want to make sure that you've got, it's going to be 2.2 kilograms, somewhere around there, if I'm doing my math right. It takes a lot of live mealworms to get down to 1 kilogram of dried mealworms. And that's where, like I mentioned, from a business perspective, I'm not taking those live mealworms and dehydrating them because I'm devaluing them from a US-based perspective. There is demand for dried mealworms, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of people that find a lot of value in them and utilize them pretty consistently. But I just haven't gotten into that market just yet. That was all 5. So we hit every question there. Hopefully this was helpful for you, Davin. Always good to get emails from you. I appreciate it. If anybody else out there has any questions and you'd like to get some responses like this, feel free to shoot them to me over at justin@midwestmealworms.com. And go ahead and put in there if you're comfortable with me posting this. I don't give out personal info, and I'm not going to identify any information here. I'm not going to share anything that you send me that you don't want to be shared. So hopefully you guys found some good value in this. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'll be happy to answer. Thank you very much. Have a good one.